Hello, my friend. Tonight, we're setting out on a journey, not to a place of gentle clouds or calming rain, but into the shadowed corridors of ancient Rome. You're about to encounter customs that may raise an eyebrow or two. Practices that, by modern standards, would spark instant backlash. This historical exploration may challenge your present-day assumptions, so before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy the content here. And as you get comfortable, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, lower the lights and let's begin this journey together. You find yourself on a crowded Roman street. The air is heavy with the smell of olive oil, perspiration, and something faintly metallic. Vendors call out to passers-by, chariot wheels clatter across stone roads, and somewhere in the distance, the roar of the Colosseum echoes. Yet beneath the surface noise, you begin to sense another rhythm, one shaped by desires and social norms that feel unfamiliar, even startling. You're stepping into a society where sexual culture was not hidden behind closed doors, but openly embedded in daily life, often in ways that would be considered shocking today. Imagine passing a public wall covered in explicit frescoes, or noticing statues of gods with exaggerated phallic features displayed casually in homes and gardens. This wasn't viewed as inappropriate or controversial. It was simply part of everyday life. To the Romans, these images were as ordinary as seeing an advertisement is to you now. Sex, for them, was not isolated from public life as it often is in the modern world. Instead, it was seen as a natural and essential element of human existence, closely tied to fertility, authority, and social structure. While contemporary societies often struggle to balance public morality with private desire, Roman culture approached sexuality in a far more fluid, though sometimes inconsistent, way. There was a practical mindset at work, especially regarding reproduction and maintaining family lines. But this practicality did not mean a lack of emotion or depth. Roman relationships, much like the empire itself, were complex. People could be deeply affectionate, intensely emotional, and openly indulgent, sometimes all at once. One notable aspect of Roman society stands out here. Unlike many modern cultures, sexual relationships between men were not broadly condemned, provided certain conditions were met. The key factor was social status and role. As long as the penetrative partner was of higher status and maintained an active role, and the receptive partner was a slave, freedman, or younger male, such acts were generally tolerated. These relationships were not defined by identity or orientation as we understand them today, but by power dynamics and social hierarchy. This may feel completely alien from a modern perspective, but in Rome, the issue was less about the gender of one's partner and more about maintaining social dominance and personal conduct. Masculinity was closely associated with control and authority, and a man's sexual behavior was expected to reflect that. It forces us to rethink how sexuality itself is shaped by cultural and social frameworks rather than universal rules. Here's another detail that reveals a great deal about Roman attitudes. The fascination with the fascinum. This was no ordinary ornament. It was a phallic charm, worn as jewelry, hung in doorways, or even used in wind chimes. Its purpose was to protect against bad luck and the evil eye. Yes, a small phallic symbol was believed to offer protection and good fortune. By Roman standards, this was entirely normal. Wearing such an object was seen as practical rather than provocative, giving the idea of a good luck charm a very literal meaning. Scholars still debate whether Romans truly viewed all sexual acts outside marriage or procreation as equally acceptable, or whether an unspoken moral code governed private behavior. Was this openness a sign of genuine freedom, or simply a different system of strict social rules defining what was allowed and what was not? As you observe daily Roman life, you try to understand these deeper moral currents rather than judging them through a modern lens. It's a complex question, one that requires setting aside personal assumptions to better understand their worldview. What becomes most striking isn't only the behavior itself, but the belief system that allowed it to exist so openly. You're not just watching history unfold, you're trying to grasp a mindset that feels fundamentally different. And as it turns out, this is only the beginning. As you continue to process the openness of Roman sexual expression, your focus shifts to a subtler but equally important part of their social structure: concubinage. While marriage was central to Roman family life, especially among the elite, it was not the only recognized form of partnership. Concubinage occupied a unique and often unclear position, offering an alternative arrangement when legal marriage was impractical or undesirable. In simple terms, it functioned as a long-term, socially acknowledged relationship without the full legal status of marriage. It was governed by established customs and carried serious implications, particularly regarding inheritance. Historically, concubinage often involved men of high status and women of lower social rank, such as freed women or those from modest backgrounds. Unlike a wife, a concubine did not share her partner's social standing, and any children from the relationship did not automatically inherit the father's name, status, or citizenship unless specific conditions were met. This distinction was critical for Roman elites. Marriage ensured legitimate heirs and protected property lines, while concubinage allowed companionship without threatening social rank or inheritance. A senator might have affection for a concubine, but his wife was responsible for producing lawful heirs and preserving his legacy, often through carefully arranged alliances. Roman emperors themselves followed this pattern. Emperor Vespasian, known for his practical leadership, maintained a long-term relationship with a concubine named Caenis, a freed woman of notable intelligence and influence. Despite their strong bond and her advisory role, she could never become his legal wife due to her background. This example shows that genuine affection and emotional connection could exist within these structured relationships, even when legal equality was impossible. It's a reminder that, then as now, human relationships often develop beyond formal rules. Personal loyalty, trust, and shared understanding could flourish, even if official recognition remained out of reach. Historians continue to debate whether concubinage functioned mainly as a practical arrangement shaped by social and legal constraints, a means for men to find companionship without the obligations of marriage to an unsuitable partner, or whether it also provided space for emotional closeness that formally arranged marriages, often driven by political or economic motives, sometimes lacked. Was it merely a secondary option, a compromise when lawful marriage was not feasible? Or, in certain situations, was it genuinely preferred as a way to maintain affection without the heavy pressures and expectations attached to a fully legal union? You reflect on this while imagining the quiet, private moments shared between a concubine and her partner, removed from public scrutiny and the rigid demands of Roman society. It was not always about forbidden pleasure alone. At times, it was about discovering a different form of connection, a relationship that existed in the liminal space between law and personal life. For a Roman woman of lower status, concubinage could even provide greater personal autonomy and a measure of financial stability than marriage, since she was not bound by the same strict expectations surrounding chastity and producing heirs for her husband's lineage. From a modern viewpoint, this arrangement may appear restrictive, yet it offered a unique mix of intimacy and social separation, showing how adaptable Roman social structures could be when managing relationships and preserving order. You begin to see that the Roman concept of family was far broader and more fluid than you first assumed, filled with many shades of gray. As you move further into the core of ancient Rome, you recognize that while concubinage allowed some social flexibility, it was overshadowed by the sheer scale and integration of prostitution. This was not a hidden vice confined to dark corners. It was a visible, often regulated feature of urban life. Imagine walking along a busy street lined with bakeries, blacksmiths, and taverns. Among them, you might notice signs or hear voices inviting you toward a brothel. It was simply another business, a service industry catering to a wide range of clients, from slaves with a few spare coins to high-ranking officials seeking discreet encounters. The atmosphere itself seems to carry an unspoken understanding that such services were part of everyday Roman life, as ordinary as visiting the forum or shopping at the market. It makes you consider how different your own daily walks might feel if public morality were not quite so private. It is well documented that prostitution in Rome was legal, widespread, and in some cases even taxed. The Roman state did not denounce the practice outright. Instead, it aimed to regulate it, often requiring prostitutes or courtesans to register with authorities. They paid a tax known as the vectigal meretricium to the state. Consider that for a moment, the government taking a share of earnings from sex work. This reveals much about Rome's pragmatic approach to morality. If something was going to occur regardless, why not formalize it and collect revenue? This stands in sharp contrast to many societies throughout history that condemned or banned the practice, forcing it underground. The Romans, true to their practical mindset, recognized that demand existed and chose to manage it rather than wage a futile battle against human behavior. This legal status did provide a level of official oversight, although how much real protection it offered the meretrices, many of whom came from the lowest social classes and were often enslaved, is a separate and rather bleak matter. It was certainly far removed from anything resembling modern labor protections. Here is a detail that may prompt a smile or at least a raised eyebrow. Roman prostitutes often wore distinctive clothing. Respectable matrons dressed in the stola, a long flowing garment, and covered their heads with veils. Prostitutes, by contrast, were sometimes required to wear a toga, traditionally male attire. This may seem strange, like appearing at a formal event in clothing from the wrong era, but it clearly marked them as separate from virtuous women. The toga was heavy and awkward for women, making it uncomfortable and further emphasizing their lower social position and public availability. It served as a visual signal of their occupation, allowing them to be easily identified in crowded areas such as markets or near public baths. In effect, it was a historical uniform designed to indicate social status and profession, not unlike modern work attire, though with a far less flattering message. You might even recognize a lupa or common prostitute by her posture or by the absence of the modest behavior expected of a Roman wife. Scholars continue to discuss whether the Roman state's regulation of prostitution was mainly about maintaining public order and generating income, or whether it also functioned to control female sexuality outside marriage, particularly in relation to married men. Did it operate as a social release valve, allowing men to seek sexual satisfaction without threatening the honor of their wives and daughters, thereby preserving the integrity of the Roman household? Or was it simply a calculated economic policy that exploited an available commodity while reinforcing social hierarchies? You can almost imagine toga-clad senators debating this issue in the Curia, perhaps after a brief visit to one of the very establishments under discussion, conveniently close to the forum. It is a complex issue that highlights how Roman society balanced law, commerce, and human desire. You realize that even in something as seemingly straightforward as prostitution, layers of social engineering were at work, reflecting Rome's deep concern with order amid what might otherwise appear as moral disorder. The Roman approach to prostitution clearly illustrates their practical, almost amoral view of human impulses. It was a service, a business, and as long as it stayed within defined social limits, it was largely tolerated if not quietly accepted. Having explored the busy streets and the regulated world of Roman prostitution, your imagined journey now takes you to a central feature of daily Roman life, the public baths. You might think of a bathhouse as a simple place for washing, perhaps a quick soak and scrub, an ancient equivalent of a local swimming pool. In Rome, however, these vast complexes were much more than places for hygiene. They functioned as social centers, gyms, libraries, dining spaces, performance venues, and, quite often, settings for various forms of interaction, both social and sexual. Picture a modern community center, a luxury spa, and a permissive club combined into one marble-lined, steam-filled space operating from morning until evening. The size and versatility of these complexes would be genuinely surprising. It is a fundamental point of Roman history that public baths, known as thermae or balnea, were essential to Roman life and open to nearly everyone, from wealthy senators to ordinary citizens. Facilities were often divided by gender or assigned specific hours for men and women, though mixed bathing also occurred at times. The routine itself was structured. Visitors typically began with exercise in the palestra, an open-air courtyard for physical activities such as wrestling or ball games. From there, they moved through a sequence of heated rooms. First the tepidarium, a warm space to adjust, then the intensely hot caldarium, where sweating was encouraged and dirt was scraped away with a strigil. The process ended with a plunge into the cold waters of the frigidarium. This was not merely about cleanliness. It was a complete sensory experience and a daily ritual that could last hours, offering time to relax, socialize, and even conduct business. Steam filled the air, mixed with conversation, splashing water, and the occasional groan from someone receiving a vigorous massage or undergoing hair removal. Now, here is a particularly eyebrow-raising detail about these bathhouses. The boundary between public and private life, especially regarding personal space and behavior, was far less defined than what modern audiences are accustomed to. Although formal brothels certainly existed, discreet arrangements, casual flirtation, and even direct sexual propositions were known to take place within the crowded and often anonymous setting of public baths. Many bath complexes included private cubicles or secluded rooms, sometimes referred to as celi meretrices, spaces believed to function as prostitutes' rooms, which could be rented for short periods. To put it simply, it's somewhat like imagining a modern public swimming pool offering a few premium changing rooms available by the hour, though with a far more questionable purpose. In these communal environments, the distinction between light flirtation, commercial exchange, and more intimate encounters was frequently unclear. These spaces naturally encouraged interaction, with their mix of nudity, relaxed social rules, and large numbers of people. It's easy to imagine the quick glances, quiet conversations, and subtle signals exchanged amid the steam, echoing voices, and constant noise of Roman citizens following their daily bathing routines. Scholars continue to debate whether sexual activity in public baths emerged spontaneously due to the open, social atmosphere, or whether some establishments quietly supported such encounters as an unofficial extra service, almost an unspoken feature of the facility. Were the baths simply locations where opportunities arose because of crowd density and lenient attitudes toward nudity? Or were some of them deliberately operating as discrete extensions of the city's red light districts, designed to meet desires beyond cleanliness and relaxation? Contemporary moral commentators like Seneca or Juvenal famously criticized the decline of Roman virtue, possibly doing so after enjoying their own bath and massage, condemning the very behaviors they observed. These discussions raise broader questions about Roman society itself. What activities were officially approved? What behaviors were merely tolerated? And what existed within the realm of unspoken social rules in a culture where public and private life often overlapped in complex ways? The public baths served as a microcosm of Roman society, blending practicality, indulgence, and occasional excess beneath one vast, steamy roof. Leaving the communal bathhouses behind, the exploration of Roman life now moves into another public domain that reveals even more about Roman attitudes toward sexuality, erotic art, and its widespread presence in everyday spaces. Modern viewers might expect such imagery to be hidden in private collections or restricted settings. However, in Roman society, explicit visuals were often openly displayed and integrated into daily life, appearing in homes, gardens, public buildings, and even religious sites. This openness challenges modern assumptions about ancient societies and forces a reconsideration of how public display was understood in the past. Archaeological evidence clearly shows that erotic imagery was not considered shameful or forbidden. Rather, it was broadly accepted and displayed across many social contexts. These works were not limited to brothels, as one might expect, but decorated private houses, bath complexes, temples dedicated to various deities, and ordinary shops or taverns. A Roman dining room, or triclinium, might feature brightly colored frescoes depicting sexual acts, while mosaic floors showed gods such as Venus and Mars in explicit scenes. Sculptures of oversized phalluses, often used as symbols of good fortune, were common decorative elements, appearing in gardens, fountains, and architectural details. This imagery was not primarily intended to shock or provoke. Instead, it formed a natural part of the visual environment and carried multiple meanings. At times it reflected religious beliefs tied to fertility, at others it served a humorous purpose, and often it expressed simple physical desire. These layers of meaning frequently overlapped. Rather than isolating erotic art as something illicit, Roman culture absorbed it into everyday surroundings. A particularly telling example of this integration can be found in ordinary household items. Many Roman oil lamps, basic ceramic or bronze objects used for lighting, were shaped like phalluses or even depicted sexual acts. These lamps illuminated dark streets, provided light for reading, or added warmth to domestic spaces. To Romans, using such an object was neither offensive nor scandalous. It was practical, symbolic, and occasionally amusing. This normalization demonstrates how deeply sexual imagery was woven into Roman life, extending even to the most mundane tools. Scholars continue to debate what this widespread display truly represents. Did it reflect a genuinely permissive society in which sexuality was openly acknowledged and visually normalized? Or did it also function as a subtle form of social conditioning, reinforcing power structures, gender expectations, and accepted sexual roles? Was it an honest expression of human nature and fertility-focused religious belief, or did it quietly promote male dominance and the availability of certain bodies? The sheer frequency of such images may have desensitized the population, making them fade into the background of daily life, much like modern advertising imagery does today. This discussion encourages reflection on how constant exposure shapes social norms and challenges modern assumptions about what is considered appropriate public display. From art and imagery, attention now shifts to one of the core institutions of Roman society, marriage. Modern audiences might assume Roman marriage emphasized strict fidelity and lifelong monogamy. While marriage was indeed highly valued for producing legitimate heirs and forming political or social alliances, expectations surrounding faithfulness, particularly for men, were marked by a significant double standard. This contrast highlights how cultural norms shape even the most fundamental relationships and reminds us that traditions are always relative to their time and place. Historically, Roman marriage, especially among the elite, functioned primarily as a social and economic contract. Unions often served to strengthen alliances between families, secure wealth, and maintain status. Legal recognition of marriage could be as simple as the bride moving her belongings into her husband's household, with ceremonies often far less formal than those seen today. Emotional attachment was frequently secondary to lineage and social strategy. For Roman women, however, fidelity was an absolute requirement. Adultery was legally punishable and could result in public disgrace, forced divorce, or in some periods, even death at the hands of a husband or father. A woman's chastity was directly tied to family honor and the legitimacy of her children. The pressure placed on Roman wives was immense, as their social standing and personal safety depended on strict adherence to this expectation. This reality underscores a striking moral imbalance. While female infidelity was severely punished, male behavior was judged by a far more lenient standard, a disparity that remains one of the most revealing aspects of Roman social structure and continues to challenge modern interpretations of ancient morality. A Roman husband's involvement with prostitutes, concubines, or enslaved individuals was generally not classified as adultery, provided the woman was not a respectable Roman matron or a freeborn citizen. This legal and social loophole effectively permitted extramarital sexual activity for men, as long as their partners belonged to a lower social rank and were not seen as infringing on another man's property or family honor. In practical terms, a man could visit brothels, keep a concubine, or have sexual relations with enslaved people he owned, and his reputation would remain largely unharmed, even if his wife was fully aware of it. Roman society, in effect, operated with two distinct standards, one applied to elite women, and another to those considered socially expendable. This reality creates a striking image of a Roman husband returning home after such encounters, with his wife aware, perhaps quietly, perhaps openly, yet unable to challenge his behavior without risking her own status or being accused of stepping beyond acceptable boundaries. Historians continue to debate whether this double standard was simply a practical accommodation of male sexual behavior based on assumptions about male desire, or a deliberate system designed to protect the purity of elite family lines. By strictly regulating the sexuality and reproductive role of high-status women, while allowing men broader and safer sexual outlets outside marriage, Roman society may have been prioritizing lineage and inheritance above all else. Whether this reflects entrenched patriarchal control or a calculated balance between personal urges and social order remains an open question. From a modern perspective, the inequality can feel jarring, even unjust. Yet understanding it requires examining the internal logic of Roman culture, where power relationships, rather than ideals of equality or romantic attachment, shaped expectations of marriage and fidelity. These norms also explain why Roman marriage was often a source of anxiety, especially for women, and why the wedding night marked such a significant and often unsettling transition into a tightly regulated social role. Having examined Roman attitudes toward fidelity, it is useful to turn to another aspect of marital life that often surprises modern audiences: divorce. If Roman marriage is imagined as a permanent, unbreakable bond, that assumption does not hold up under closer scrutiny. While forming a household and preserving its stability were important goals, ending a marriage was often far simpler than one might expect. Divorce in Rome was not typically a prolonged or hostile legal process. In many cases, it was straightforward and even routine. During the late Republic and early Empire, divorce was relatively common and easy to obtain. Unlike societies that required religious annulments, lengthy court proceedings, or approval from extended family members, a Roman marriage could often be dissolved through a clear declaration of intent by either spouse. A spoken statement or written notice could be enough to formally end the union. This was particularly true for marriages contracted sine manu, which became increasingly prevalent. In such arrangements, the wife remained under the legal authority of her father or guardian rather than transferring into her husband's household. As a result, she could return to her natal family, reclaim her dowry, and the marriage was effectively concluded. This flexibility contrasts sharply with the sacred and permanent view of marriage found in many other cultures and eras. Roman marriage emphasized practicality and personal choice over lifelong vows. Historical accounts reinforce this view. Roman literature contains numerous examples of prominent figures marrying and divorcing multiple times, often for political advantage or financial necessity. Cicero, for example, divorced his wife Terentia after 3 decades of marriage, reportedly to secure a wealthier dowry to resolve financial difficulties, and soon remarried a much younger woman. While his motives may have drawn criticism, the act of divorce itself was not widely condemned. Among the elite, marriage functioned as a strategic alliance, and divorce was simply another available option within that system. Scholars continue to discuss whether the increasing ease of divorce reflected greater personal autonomy, especially for women who could initiate separation more easily, or whether it contributed to what some Roman moralists viewed as a decline in traditional values. Was this adaptability a sensible response to social complexity, or a sign of instability within the family structure? Contemporary complaints from conservative writers suggest that such changes were controversial even at the time. The tension between individual freedom and social cohesion, evident in these debates, remains familiar today. The relative simplicity of Roman divorce reshaped expectations of commitment and partnership. Despite the outward importance placed on household stability, Roman marriages could, in practice, be far more fragile than they appeared. This fluidity, combined with broader sexual norms, reveals a society that often defies modern assumptions. From marriage and divorce, the discussion naturally extends to another area frequently misunderstood through a modern lens: same-sex relations. Rome was neither uniformly restrictive nor entirely permissive. Instead, attitudes towards same-sex activity were shaped by status, power, and social roles rather than by concepts of sexual orientation. The key issue was not whether someone was attracted to men or women, but how they behaved and with whom. Same-sex sexual activity, particularly between men, was widely recognized and, within certain limits, socially acceptable. The defining distinction lay between the active, penetrative partner and the passive, receptive one. For a freeborn Roman man, taking the active role with a male slave, freedman, or prostitute was generally not considered dishonorable. On the contrary, it could be interpreted as an expression of dominance and masculine authority. The act was understood in terms of power, not identity. However, the social consequences shifted dramatically if a freeborn adult man assumed the receptive role. This position was often viewed as degrading and incompatible with ideals of Roman masculinity. Satirists and moral commentators regularly mocked men perceived as passive, portraying them as weak, unmanly, and morally suspect. A man of high status could engage sexually with another male and suffer no damage to his reputation, so long as he maintained the dominant role. But being identified as receptive could lead to severe social disgrace. In this system, the details of role and status mattered far more than the gender of one's partner. Roman sexual norms operated along a narrow and carefully maintained line, where reputation depended less on behavior itself and more on how that behavior aligned with established hierarchies of power and control. This passage highlights how deeply Roman identity was connected to performance and outward presentation. Scholars continue to debate whether Roman tolerance of male same-sex relations reflected a true absence of moral judgment about the act itself, placing emphasis instead on hierarchy and power, or whether it represented a practical accommodation of behaviors that could not be eliminated and were therefore shaped into socially acceptable patterns. Did Roman society simply lack modern categories of sexual identity? Or was this tolerance a strategic mechanism through which a patriarchal system reinforced control by defining acceptable gender roles and expectations? It is worth considering whether men who assumed the passive role genuinely internalized the shame imposed by society, or whether private spaces offered a sense of autonomy absent from public life. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about sexuality and orientation, reminding us that historical cultures often operated within conceptual systems very different from our own. The result was a structure that appeared flexible in certain areas while remaining highly restrictive in others, a notable contradiction. As previously discussed in our earlier material, male concubines in ancient Greece experienced social stigma, restricted legal standing, economic dependence, and limited institutional protection, and they were denied the status and safeguards associated with marriage. While parallels exist, Roman power dynamics introduced distinct variations. After navigating the complex hierarchies of Roman same-sex relations, the discussion moves into a more explicit and unusual domain of religious life, the cult of Priapus. Beyond curious phallic objects, this tradition centered on a deity defined by a permanently erect phallus. Far from being a marginal cult, the worship of Priapus was widespread and often treated with humor, reflecting Roman comfort with themes of fertility and protection. This illustrates how sexuality was embedded even within sacred practices. Priapus was a minor yet commonly revered god associated with fertility, gardens, vineyards, and male sexuality. He was typically portrayed as exaggerated and grotesque, with his oversized phallus symbolizing protective and beneficial forces. His primary function was to guard agricultural spaces from theft and to promote abundance, and his prominent anatomy was believed to have apotropaic qualities, capable of warding off evil and attracting good fortune. Images of Priapus, often crafted from wood or terracotta, were commonly placed at garden entrances, orchards, and sometimes inside homes. Their presence conveyed an unmistakable warning to intruders. An important aspect of his cult was its openly humorous and coarse tone. Inscriptions accompanying these figures were frequently explicit, containing crude threats directed at potential thieves, often describing punishment in graphic anatomical terms. These messages were publicly visible and formed part of a lighthearted yet firm approach to property protection. The combination of reverence and vulgarity reveals a Roman ease with merging sacred belief and everyday life in ways that contrast sharply with modern sensibilities. Scholars continue to examine the apparent contradiction within the worship of Priapus. How could a figure defined by overt sexuality also function as a sacred guardian? Was his exaggerated form primarily a symbol of fertility and agricultural success, or did it also express deeper cultural concerns about masculinity, power, and control? Humor may have played a role in easing discomfort and making such imagery more acceptable to a broad audience. This analysis demonstrates how ancient societies used symbolism, wit, and religious practice to address fundamental issues such as reproduction, ownership, and desire, often with a directness that feels unfamiliar today. The cult of Priapus stands as a clear reminder that, for Romans, the human body and its functions were integrated into their understanding of the divine. From this emphasis on fertility, the focus shifts to a contrasting institution marked by strict restraint, the Vestal Virgins. Where Priapus represented abundance and sexual potency, the Vestals embodied enforced chastity in service to the state and its sacred traditions. Their existence combined exceptional privilege with severe risk, governed by vows whose violation carried the harshest consequences. Historically, the Vestal Virgins were an all-female priesthood devoted to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their central responsibility was maintaining the sacred fire in Vesta's temple in the Roman Forum, a flame believed to symbolize Rome's continuity and prosperity. Its extinction was regarded as a sign of impending catastrophe. Chosen from elite families at a young age, typically between 6 and 10 years old, Vestals committed to a 30-year term of service and a strict vow of chastity. While living within the temple precincts, they enjoyed rare privileges for Roman women. They could own property, were not subject to male guardianship, and held public honor, including reserved seating at major events. Despite these advantages, their position carried severe penalties. Any Vestal found guilty of incestum or sexual transgression was condemned to death by burial alive. The condemned priestess was ceremonially led to an underground chamber near the Colline Gate, provided with minimal supplies, and sealed inside to die slowly. If her partner was identified, he was executed by public scourging. This punishment reflected the perceived link between a Vestal's purity and the safety of the state. The severity contrasts sharply with the relative tolerance shown toward male sexual behavior, highlighting the heavy burden placed on female chastity when tied to political and religious stability. Historians debate whether these extreme measures were driven by genuine religious fear or functioned as a performative strategy to maintain social discipline and patriarchal authority over influential women. The psychological impact on young girls living under such constant threat is difficult to ignore. A single accusation, whether justified or not, could result in a slow and terrifying death. This reality underscores the intense pressures faced by women in Roman society, even those granted extraordinary status within its rigid social order. A sharp contrast emerges when compared to the more open expressions of sexuality seen elsewhere. In another part of Roman society, the Vestal Virgins represented perhaps the most extreme form of sexual regulation. Their lives functioned as a sacred enclosure, bound by honor and strict discipline. Moving away from this intense self-denial, the focus shifts once again, this time toward the Roman state's broader attempts to regulate not only individual conduct but collective behavior. Through sumptuary laws, Roman authorities sought to control desire itself by shaping social habits. At first glance, one might assume that such an outwardly permissive society allowed unrestricted indulgence. However, Roman leaders, particularly those with strong moral convictions, repeatedly tried to limit what they viewed as excess. This included sexual indulgence, though often indirectly, through legislation. These laws were as much about reinforcing traditional values and social hierarchy as they were about financial restraint. They aimed to restrict how much citizens could spend, what they could wear, and even what they were allowed to eat, all in the name of preserving the moral strength of the Republic. Historical records clearly show that during the later Roman Republic and into the early Empire, a series of sumptuary laws were enacted. These measures attempted to limit excessive spending on banquets, clothing, jewelry, and even funerals. While not explicitly focused on sexual behavior, they reflected broader concerns about public morality and the preservation of traditional Roman virtues such as moderation and restraint. The underlying belief was that luxury encouraged moral decline, which in turn weakened both citizens and the state itself. In simple terms, the government was saying, stop overspending, stop overindulging, it harms both society and character. These laws reveal a persistent anxiety about wealth and pleasure eroding what Romans idealized as their ancestral values of simplicity and discipline. One particularly revealing example highlights how specific these regulations could become. Some sumptuary laws dictated the number of courses permitted at a dinner or restricted certain types of food, especially expensive meats. While this might appear to target culinary excess alone, it also functioned as a way to limit long, extravagant feasts, settings that could easily lead to heavy drinking or illicit encounters. By reducing luxury, lawmakers hoped to reduce the behaviors that often followed it. The logic was indirect but intentional. Fewer rare delicacies meant fewer guests attending purely for indulgence. It was an attempt to control sexual behavior by restricting the environments that encouraged it. At the same time, Romans were known for creatively navigating these rules, finding loopholes that allowed them to maintain status and enjoyment, perhaps by serving fewer dishes, each exceptionally rare. The law might limit quantity, but not ingenuity. Historians continue to debate whether these sumptuary laws were genuinely effective or largely symbolic. Were they successful in shaping behavior, or were they mostly ignored by a population determined to enjoy life? Did they meaningfully reduce excess, or did they simply allow moral conservatives to voice disapproval of social change? More broadly, such questions reflect the enduring tension between legal authority and human desire. History suggests that attempts to legislate morality often struggle against deeply ingrained social impulses, and Rome was no exception. Despite repeated efforts, desire persisted in various forms, frequently undermining or bypassing the very laws meant to suppress it. With these legal attempts in mind, attention now turns away from regulation and toward understanding, specifically, how Romans viewed sex through the lens of medicine. One might expect ancient medical thought to be simplistic or dominated by superstition. While some ideas may seem misguided today, Roman medicine, heavily influenced by Greek scholars, did attempt to explain sexual health and desire systematically. Though their conclusions differ greatly from modern science, their efforts reveal how ancient thinkers tried to make sense of the human body and its drives. Ancient texts show that Roman physicians, following figures such as Hippocrates and Galen, considered sexual activity important for both physical and mental health. Bodily fluids, particularly semen, were believed to play a vital role in overall well-being. In men, retaining semen was thought to cause illness, while excessive sexual activity was believed to weaken the body. Balance, therefore, was essential. Moderate sexual release was considered healthy and necessary, framed not as indulgence but as a means of maintaining bodily harmony, similar to balancing the humors. Medical advice could even include recommendations about sexual frequency, prescribed not for emotional reasons but for physical stability. Some beliefs regarding female sexuality were more problematic. Certain medical texts claimed that unfulfilled female desire could cause a condition known as the wandering womb or uterine suffocation. The womb was imagined as a mobile organ capable of moving through the body, producing symptoms such as anxiety or discomfort if deprived of moisture or sexual activity. Treatments often involved marriage, pregnancy, or intercourse to restore balance. This theory, though scientifically unfounded and deeply biased, reveals how medical explanations were shaped by social expectations of women. It reinforced the belief that female health was inseparable from reproduction and marriage. While the idea may seem absurd today, it highlights how cultural assumptions influenced medical thinking. Scholars still debate whether such theories reflected sincere attempts at understanding anatomy or functioned mainly as tools to justify patriarchal norms. Did physicians truly believe the uterus could move freely, or did these explanations conveniently support social pressure on women to conform to specific roles? This question invites reflection on how modern science may also carry unseen cultural biases. These ancient medical views demonstrate how social norms, gender roles, and scientific inquiry were tightly interconnected, producing a mix of observation, speculation, and cultural reinforcement in explanations of desire. From medical theory, the narrative now shifts toward one of Rome's most enduring legends: its pursuit of pleasure through extravagant feasting. Roman banquets are often associated with excess, but their scale and intensity frequently surpassed expectations. These gatherings extended far beyond food, becoming immersive social spectacles where boundaries dissolved. Elite banquets were central to Roman social life. They served as platforms for displaying wealth, strengthening political ties, and hosting entertainment that ranged from refined to overtly crude. These were lengthy, multi-course events lasting well into the night. Guests reclined while slaves served food and wine, and performers, including musicians, dancers, acrobats, and poets, provided continuous diversion. The amount of food and drink consumed was extraordinary. These events combined fine dining, performance, and prolonged social interaction, often ending in personal encounters once formalities faded. One particularly striking and well-documented practice was intentional vomiting. Wealthy Romans sometimes induced vomiting during feasts to continue eating and drinking without interruption, underscoring the extreme levels of indulgence that characterized elite banqueting culture. The philosopher Seneca, for example, famously mocked those who would vomit so they could continue eating, and then eat again only to vomit once more. While this behavior may not have occurred at every social gathering, the fact that it was recognized and criticized says a great deal about the extremes some Romans pursued in their desire for excess and prolonged indulgence. It certainly gives new meaning to the idea of eating one's fill. This practice made it possible to extend the sensation of pleasure by overriding the natural limits of the body, allowing feasting, and the indulgence associated with it, to continue far beyond normal restraint. A recurring point of debate among historians concerns whether descriptions of especially extravagant Roman banquets, including those said to involve explicit sexual activity among guests, should be taken as reliable historical accounts or seen as exaggerated literary devices. Moralizing authors such as Juvenal, or later writers seeking sensational appeal, may have embellished these scenes. Were such events truly common among the Roman elite, or were they rare and extreme cases amplified to highlight what was perceived as moral decline? It is worth considering whether this behavior was an accepted element of high-status social life or more often limited to specific, less respectable settings. This discussion encourages reflection on the biases present in historical sources and how much our understanding of the past is shaped by the intentions of those who recorded it. Regardless of how frequent these events actually were, the fact that they were imaginable and described at all reveals much about the outer limits of Roman excess and their complicated relationship with pleasure. From the indulgence of Roman banquets, attention now turns to a far darker aspect of Roman sexual practices, the reality of slavery and sexual exploitation. Much of what has been discussed so far involves the choices and social structures affecting free Romans. The experiences of enslaved people, however, present a sharply different reality, one in which personal freedom, including sexual autonomy, was almost entirely absent. Here, the practical and often ruthless efficiency of Roman society reveals its most dehumanizing side. It is an unavoidable historical fact that slavery was deeply embedded in Roman society and formed a core part of its economy. Enslaved individuals were regarded as property rather than persons, with no legal rights of their own. Their bodies were completely subject to the authority of their owners. As a result, sexual exploitation was widespread and fully permitted under Roman law. Enslaved men, women, and children could, and often did, face sexual use by owners, guests, or others, and they could even be rented out for such purposes without consent. This was a world in which an individual's body did not belong to them but functioned as a tradable asset. The absence of agency for enslaved people stands as one of the most severe realities of the Roman system and fundamentally shaped their experience of sexuality, or more accurately, the denial of it. A particularly disturbing detail highlights how systematic this exploitation was. Some enslaved individuals were deliberately trained or acquired specifically for sexual services, either for private use within households or for profit in brothels. These brothels were often owned and operated by free citizens who controlled enslaved prostitutes. The language used to describe these individuals was frequently dehumanizing, reinforcing their treatment as objects rather than people. Owners could loan or rent out enslaved individuals for sexual purposes, viewing them as sources of income. This was not a marginal practice but an accepted and deeply ingrained feature of slavery. The extreme imbalance of power meant that sexual abuse was a constant and terrifying possibility for countless enslaved men, women, and children. Considering the organized nature of this exploitation underscores the profound level of dehumanization involved. Historians continue to debate how widespread and routine sexual violence against enslaved people truly was, particularly given the lack of surviving accounts from the victims themselves. Another related question is whether the ready availability of enslaved bodies for sexual use shaped the sexual norms of free Roman citizens, reinforcing double standards for women and encouraging casual male promiscuity. Alternatively, was this exploitation a grim but contained outcome of the broader institution of slavery? These questions invite reflection on the psychological effects on both the enslaved and the enslavers, and how such a system could exist alongside Rome's well-known legal and philosophical achievements. This aspect of Roman life serves as a stark reminder that beneath the empire's grandeur lay deep injustices woven into everyday existence, making even the excesses of free Roman sexuality seem restrained by comparison. Having examined the harsh realities of sexual exploitation within Roman slavery, the focus now turns to those who reflected on society itself, philosophers who sought to define the role of pleasure. One might assume that Roman thinkers, with their emphasis on duty and virtue, rejected all forms of physical enjoyment. In practice, their views were more complex. Different philosophical schools debated desire, enjoyment, and bodily satisfaction as part of a good life, resulting in a wide range of perspectives that directly or indirectly addressed sexual behavior. Roman intellectual culture was heavily shaped by Greek philosophy, particularly Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Cynicism, each offering a distinct approach to pleasure, or voluptas. Stoic thinkers such as Seneca and Epictetus promoted emotional discipline and self-control, viewing excessive pleasure as a distraction from reason and virtue. For them, happiness came from living in harmony with nature and mastering desire rather than giving in to it. While they did not necessarily oppose sexual activity within marriage for procreation, they warned against seeking sex purely for pleasure, seeing it as a path toward moral weakness. Maintaining strict self-discipline was central to their worldview, much like constantly exercising a muscle to keep it strong. By contrast, the Epicureans, often mistakenly labeled as advocates of indulgence, offered a more restrained philosophy of pleasure. True Epicurean pleasure, as described by figures like Lucretius in De Rerum Natura, emphasized freedom from pain and disturbance, known as ataraxia. This approach valued friendship, intellectual engagement, and modest physical comfort over excess. While bodily pleasure was acknowledged, Epicureans cautioned against overindulgence that could lead to future discomfort or anxiety. From this perspective, a calm and intimate experience could be preferable to an extravagant feast, as it promoted lasting peace of mind. It is comparable to choosing a carefully prepared cup of tea instead of an intense but short-lived sugar high. Scholars often question whether these philosophical ideas meaningfully influenced everyday sexual behavior in Rome or remained abstract discussions among educated elites. Did ordinary Romans consider Seneca's warnings or Lucretius's distinctions amid the demands of daily life? Or were these philosophies largely theoretical, shaping thought more than practice? This raises the broader issue of whether philosophers aimed to guide society or simply respond to the excesses they observed. The tension between ideals and reality remains a central theme, highlighting how difficult it is for philosophical principles, however thoughtful, to reshape deeply rooted desires and social customs. Even so, these ideas provide an important lens for understanding Roman sexual culture, revealing as much about intellectual aspirations as about actual behavior. From these reflective and sometimes conflicting philosophical views on pleasure, attention now turns to another expressive outlet of Roman sexuality, erotic literature and poetry. If you picture dry academic volumes, think again. Roman authors, ranging from clever satirists to openly crude voices, left behind a vast collection of poems, plays, and prose that examined desire, attraction, seduction, and explicit sexual encounters with a directness that can still feel surprising today. It was a cultural world in which passion, yearning, and lust were openly expressed through refined Latin verse, often intended to be read aloud or performed, adding another dimension to an already candid society. One important fact of literary history is that Roman writing, particularly poetry, contains an unusually rich body of erotic material, frequently including explicit sexual references that range from gentle expressions of affection to graphic descriptions of physical acts. Poets such as Catullus explored deeply personal emotions, including his turbulent relationship with Lesbia, likely Clodia Metelli, combining intense feeling with sharp, controlled language. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, presented playful, ironic, and highly detailed guidance on seduction, finding partners, and sustaining affairs, all framed through suggestive and often provocative examples. Equally striking are the works of Martial, whose epigrams rely on biting humor and blunt depictions of sexual behavior, often presented without softening language. These writings are not isolated instances. Together, they form a substantial body of literature that reflects a broad acceptance of discussing sexual matters openly within public literary culture. One particularly revealing detail from this tradition involves Ovid's Ars Amatoria, a text often compared to an ancient guide to courtship and affairs. Its notoriety is believed to have played a role in Ovid's exile under Emperor Augustus. At the time, Augustus was promoting moral reform and a return to traditional Roman values. A book that appeared to encourage infidelity and secret relationships clearly conflicted with that agenda. In this sense, Ovid was effectively punished for the perceived social impact of his writing. The issue was not only the erotic content itself, but the belief that such works undermined public morality. This episode highlights the power literature held to provoke admiration as well as strong condemnation, even in the ancient world. Scholars continue to debate whether the explicit nature of Roman erotic literature accurately reflected everyday sexual behavior or whether it was exaggerated for artistic effect, satire, or intellectual resistance to conservative norms. Were these texts realistic portrayals of Roman life, or were they distorted representations created to entertain, challenge authority, or provoke thought? This question is similar to modern discussions about whether contemporary media reflects reality or amplifies certain aspects for effect. Such debates encourage a closer examination of how art and lived experience interact, and how literary works may contain layers of irony, intention, and commentary beyond their surface meaning. Regardless of interpretation, the volume and openness of Roman erotic writing provide a valuable, if sometimes uncomfortable, insight into Roman attitudes towards sex and desire. From literary expression, the focus now shifts toward altered states and the role of intoxication, particularly through the influence of Bacchus and wine. While Roman banquets were already known for excess, the worship of Bacchus, the god of wine, fertility, ecstasy, and ritual madness, represented indulgence taken much further. This was not simply about drinking. It was a religious practice centered on abandoning restraint and dissolving social boundaries, often resulting in uninhibited sexual behavior. Bacchus, known as Dionysus in Greek tradition, was widely worshipped, and his cult emphasized ecstatic rituals and heavy wine consumption. Unlike the formal state religions, Bakshik rites, known as bacchanalia, were frequently held in private, especially in their early stages. These gatherings involved intense music, dancing, and intoxication. Followers believed that through collective ecstasy and drunkenness, they could achieve a state of divine madness that allowed them to move beyond ordinary identity and connect with the god directly. In these moments, conventional moral expectations, including those governing sexual behavior, were often set aside. The goal was a complete loss of self within a shared emotional and physical experience. A notable historical event illustrates how deeply unsettling these practices appeared to Roman authorities. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree that sharply restricted the bacchanalia. The stated reasons included concerns about moral decay, criminal plots, and inappropriate sexual conduct during nighttime ceremonies. The historian Livy describes scenes of extreme excess, including sexual disorder, falsified documents, and even poisonings, though modern scholars suspect his account was exaggerated to reinforce moral warnings. Even so, the severity of the state's response indicates that these rituals were viewed as a serious threat to public order and traditional values, largely because they encouraged behavior far outside accepted norms. Researchers continue to question whether the suppression of the Bacchanalia was truly driven by widespread misconduct or whether it reflected political anxiety over large, unsupervised gatherings that challenged established authority. It remains unclear whether sexual freedom was a central element of the religious experience or a justification used by officials to exert control. This debate highlights how concerns over morality can sometimes conceal deeper fears about social instability. Whatever the underlying motives, Bacchus and wine clearly offered Romans a temporary escape from rigid social structures, creating moments where normally unacceptable behavior became briefly acceptable. From ritual intoxication, the discussion moves to a physical location that offers direct evidence of Roman sexual commerce: the Lupanar of Pompeii. Unlike broader references to prostitution or indirect mentions of sexual encounters, this site provides a preserved, tangible example of a Roman brothel, frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 C. It offers a rare and detailed view into the daily operation of a space dedicated to commercial sex. Pompeii contains the most complete surviving Roman brothel, known as the Lupanar, from lupa, a slang term for prostitute. This two-story structure, located near the city forum, includes 10 small rooms, 5 on each floor, each furnished with a stone bed. The walls are covered with explicit frescoes depicting various sexual acts and positions. These images were not symbolic or subtle. They functioned as clear visual representations of the services available, effectively serving as advertisements. In addition to these frescoes, the rooms also contain graffiti scratched into the walls by clients and sex workers. These markings include names, dates, brief remarks, and sometimes crude comments. Some record boasts from visitors, while others simply list the names of the women who worked there. Though informal and fragmentary, this writing adds a human dimension to the site, offering direct traces of individual lives within and other. These markings serve as quiet reminders of the personal experiences, hardships, and transactions that took place in those confined spaces, leaving behind human voices etched permanently into stone. Archaeologists and social historians often debate whether the Lupanar of Pompeii reflects a standard Roman brothel typical across the empire, or whether its exceptional preservation makes it an unusual, possibly overstated example. This raises an important question: how much can a single site truly tell us about prostitution throughout the expansive Roman world? It naturally leads to curiosity about the everyday experiences of the enslaved women and men who worked there, and whether they could maintain any sense of personal identity or private life within such exploitative conditions. These questions highlight the limits of archaeological evidence and remind us that even the most revealing discoveries must be interpreted with caution. Still, the Lupanar offers a rare and unsettling insight into the commercial dimensions of Roman sexuality, providing a direct, tangible connection to the desires and social realities that shaped ancient lives. Moving beyond the stark remains of the Lupanar, the focus shifts to an act fundamental to the survival of Roman society: childbirth and the fertility rituals associated with it. For Romans, producing children was not merely a personal decision but a civic responsibility, essential to maintaining family lineage and strengthening the state. As a result, conception, pregnancy, and birth were deeply embedded in religious and cultural practices aimed at securing divine support for successful reproduction. Fertility, particularly the birth of male heirs, formed a core pillar of Roman social organization. Marriage for women was largely centered on procreation, and motherhood was regarded as their most respected and necessary role. A wife's position and security within her household often depended on her ability to bear children. Consequently, couples facing infertility frequently turned to prayers, offerings, and rituals dedicated to deities linked to fertility and childbirth. The pressure placed on Roman women to conceive quickly was considerable. If months or years passed without pregnancy, concern and social scrutiny intensified, as the continuation of the family line depended entirely on successful childbirth. One notable ritual reflecting this urgency was the festival of Lupercalia, held annually on February 15th. During the event, priests known as Luperci ran through the streets wearing goat skins and lightly struck women with strips made from sacrificed goats. Rather than being viewed as harmful, this act was considered beneficial. Women hoping to conceive or seeking an easier delivery would actively present themselves, believing the ritual would promote fertility and reduce labor pain. While such practices may appear unusual today, for Romans they carried deep symbolic meaning, rooted in ancient traditions believed to protect both individual families and the wider community. Scholars continue to debate whether these fertility rituals and societal expectations were driven primarily by sincere religious belief and concern for family continuity, or whether they also functioned as mechanisms to regulate female sexuality within a patriarchal system. Did these customs elevate women through their role as mothers, or did they primarily reinforce expectations centered on reproduction? This question invites reflection on how bodily autonomy and reproductive choices were shaped by religious authority and social obligation. Roman concepts of honor, duty, and sexuality were closely connected to their beliefs about divine purpose and human reproduction, and these values deeply influenced marriage and family life. After examining childbirth and fertility, attention turns to a more practical and often hazardous subject: contraception and abortion. It might be assumed that without modern medicine, Romans had little control over reproduction. However, literary and archaeological sources indicate that they used a variety of methods, many adapted from Greek medical knowledge. These approaches, though often unreliable or dangerous, demonstrate a clear desire to manage fertility and family size. Methods included topical applications such as olive oil, cedar resin, or even lead-based substances applied vaginally, though the latter posed severe health risks. More commonly, herbal remedies were consumed or used as pessaries. Plants such as silphium, pennyroyal, and wild carrot were believed to prevent conception. The popularity of these remedies, despite uncertain effects, shows a deliberate effort by both women and men to influence reproductive outcomes for economic, health, or personal reasons. Some methods went beyond prevention and were intended to induce abortion. Strong herbal mixtures made from plants like savon or rue were used to trigger miscarriage. These practices were extremely risky, often leading to serious illness, bleeding, or death due to the absence of standardized dosages and medical knowledge. Even when successful, the physical cost could be severe. The reliance on potent substances underscores the difficult choices women faced when dealing with unwanted pregnancies and reveals the dangerous reality of reproductive control in the ancient world. Debate continues among historians regarding Roman attitudes toward abortion. While it was not treated as a criminal act in the same way as infanticide, legal texts suggest that a husband could take action against his wife if she terminated a pregnancy without his consent, as this deprived him of a legitimate heir. This indicates that abortion was tolerated in practice but remained socially and legally complex, often governed by male authority rather than female autonomy. The limited moral commentary in surviving sources may reflect practical acceptance or simply the perspective of male authors whose voices dominate the historical record. This discussion highlights how reproductive control was closely tied to power structures and social values, an issue that remains relevant today. Having explored the risks and realities of reproductive management, the focus now shifts to public expressions of intimacy. While Romans are often imagined as reserved and restrained, evidence from art and literature suggests a more nuanced reality. Physical closeness and touch were common and socially acceptable, particularly in non-sexual contexts, and in certain situations even romantic or sexual gestures occurred openly. These practices challenge modern assumptions about ancient modesty and reveal a society that balanced decorum with a relatively comfortable approach to physical expression. Roman public life, therefore, included a level of visible intimacy that may be unexpected, but was firmly embedded in their social norms. Friends and family, both men and women, frequently walked arm in arm, embraced warmly, or held hands without any romantic implication. This behavior was a common expression of friendship, camaraderie, and social connection. Picture two adult male senators strolling through the forum, arm in arm, discussing politics comfortably. Such non-romantic physical intimacy is far less common in many modern Western cultures, where personal space is more strictly observed. For Romans, touch was an essential part of social interaction, a language that communicated relationships, whether familial or platonic. One striking example of public affection comes from the poet Martial, who casually mentions lovers kissing openly, even in crowded spaces. While full sexual acts were never performed openly in the forum, discreet kisses, embraces, and flirtatious gestures were common in urban life. Imagine a couple sharing a quiet kiss behind a market stall or whispering sweet words in a public garden. These moments were considered normal and natural expressions of human connection, not scandalous acts. This contrast reminds us that, even in a society with different moral codes, human tenderness still found a way to surface. Historians debate the limits of acceptable public affection in Rome. Did the Romans' ease with physical touch reflect a genuinely relaxed attitude toward decorum, or did it reinforce social hierarchies, allowing certain touches only between people of specific statuses? Was the tolerance of male-male affection a sign of true acceptance or simply overlooked as long as it aligned with existing power structures? This invites reflection on how cultural norms around touch can reveal both openness and subtle social distinctions. The Roman street, therefore, was more than a space for commerce and politics. It was a stage where the full spectrum of human relationships was enacted, often quite physically. From this tactile social world, we now move into the mystical side of Roman desire, love magic. Despite their reputation for engineering and law, Romans were deeply superstitious. Matters of the heart, especially unrequited love or jealousy, often led people to seek supernatural help. Love spells, curses, and charms were widespread, practiced across all social classes. These rituals were rarely elaborate. Instead, they combined traditional beliefs, imported mystical practices, and simple folk remedies. Specialists, magicians, sorcerers, or cunning women crafted love charms, binding spells, or curse tablets to influence affection, fidelity, rival relationships, or even sexual impotence. Imagine a person desperate for affection, burying a lead tablet engraved with someone's name in a hidden graveyard, hoping unseen forces would sway their will. Many love spells required unusual or even gruesome ingredients, burning herbs, tying knots, using animal parts, or drawing images on wax dolls. Hair, nail clippings, or clothing fragments of the target were often included to create a sympathetic connection. In effect, it was a macabre version of a modern dating app. Rather than swiping, people attempted to manipulate destiny itself. These rituals highlight the intensity of belief and desire that drove such practices. Classicists continue to debate whether these spells reflected genuine faith in supernatural power or served as psychological tools, empowering the practitioner and intimidating others. Did Romans truly believe a curse tablet could compel affection, or did performing the ritual simply give them agency in matters beyond their control? The line between superstition, placebo, and spiritual belief was often blurred. Love magic, then, was more than a quaint oddity. It was a deeply human response to universal desires and anxieties. When conventional methods failed, the Romans did not hesitate to try bending reality itself. Leaving love magic behind, we turn to the pervasive influence of Greek culture on Roman life, particularly regarding sexual attitudes. While Rome developed its own empire and legal systems, much of its intellectual, artistic, and philosophical framework was borrowed from Greece. This influence shaped the Romans' approach to desire, pleasure, and sexual expression. For instance, Greek acceptance of pederastic relationships between adult men and adolescent boys influenced Roman comfort with same-sex interactions, especially involving younger, lower-status males. Romans adapted these practices through their own lens of status and power. Greek culture also inspired social institutions like the symposium, which Romans transformed into the convivium or banquet. While Romans often made these gatherings grander and more indulgent, the mix of philosophical discussion, entertainment, and opportunities for homoerotic interaction echoed Greek traditions. Thus, Roman social and sexual customs were not mere architectural or artistic imports, they were frameworks for leisure and desire. Historians continue to debate how much Roman sexual practice was a direct continuation of Greek norms versus a distinctively Roman development. Did the Romans genuinely adopt Greek sexual fluidity, or did they simply put a distinctly Roman, hierarchical twist on it? One might wonder if Rome's apparent tolerance for certain same-sex relationships was truly an influence from Greek culture, or if Roman social structures alone would have allowed such behaviors, merely shaping how they were expressed. This question invites you to distinguish between genuine cultural adaptation and superficial borrowing, highlighting the complex interaction of imported ideas and local innovation in shaping human behavior, including intimate practices that define a society. The Roman engagement with Greek culture was rarely passive. It was an active process of adoption, reinterpretation, and transformation, producing a sexual landscape that was uniquely Roman while still reflecting Hellenic influences. Having traced these Greek undercurrents, your focus now shifts to the voices of dissent within Rome, moralists who repeatedly sounded alarms. You might ask, with all this openness and indulgence, did no one object? Oh, they certainly did. A steady chorus of Roman writers, philosophers, and politicians lamented what they saw as the moral decay of their era, concentrating on sexual excess, luxury, and the erosion of traditional Roman virtues. These were the ancient equivalent of opinionated columnists scolding the younger generation. Roman literature repeatedly highlights that many prominent authors, particularly from the late Republic and early Empire, engaged in fervent moralizing. Figures such as Juvenal, Seneca, and Tacitus criticized what they considered widespread decadence. Philosophical works and historical accounts contrasted the perceived moral purity and disciplined austerity of old Rome with the hedonism of contemporary society. Extravagant feasts, rampant adultery, and the supposed effeminacy of men were frequent targets. For these writers, the decline of sexual morality was more than a personal failing. It threatened the stability and strength of the Roman state. Imagine endless complaints about youth corruption, but delivered with elegant Latin verse and a sneer. A striking irony emerges among these moralists. Many of those condemning indulgence and luxury were themselves members of the elite, benefiting from the wealth and privileges that enabled such behaviors. Seneca, for example, preached stoic moderation while amassing considerable personal wealth. Juvenal criticized Roman women's supposed promiscuity while writing poems rich in explicit detail, arguably perpetuating the very behaviors he condemned. It's akin to a celebrity chef promoting healthy eating while secretly indulging in nightly fast food binges. This hypocrisy raises questions. Were these moralists genuinely committed to reform, or were they performing a social role, seeking intellectual or political recognition by criticizing behaviors they may have observed or practiced themselves? Scholars must also consider whether these writings accurately reflect Rome's sexual and moral realities, or if they are rhetorical exaggerations meant to entertain as much as to reform. Did Rome truly plunge into moral decay, or were these laments a recurring literary trope mourning a golden age that perhaps never existed? Regardless of accuracy, the volume and vehemence of these moralistic complaints offer valuable insight into Roman anxieties over shifting sexual norms. They form a loud, indignant counter-narrative to the seeming permissiveness of the era, showing that not everyone was comfortable with societal change. From these moralist protests, your focus now shifts to a specific transgression consistently scrutinized and punished: infidelity. While we've noted the double standards surrounding fidelity in Roman marriage, it's crucial to understand the social and legal consequences, particularly for women. This reveals the sharp enforcement behind Rome's moral code, even when unevenly applied. Adultery, especially by a wife, carried severe legal repercussions. Under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, enacted by Augustus in 18 BCE, adultery became a public crime. In extreme cases, a husband could legally kill his wife and her lover if caught in flagrante delicto in his home. More commonly, the husband was required to divorce his wife, who would lose part of her dowry and might be banished to an island. The lover could also face banishment and property loss. This was far from a private matter. It amounted to public ruin. A fascinating nuance exists in the law: the concept of adultery by accident, stuprum, covering relations between a freeborn man and an unmarried freeborn woman, widow, or virgin. While still illegal and punishable by fines or exile, it carried lighter consequences than adultery with a married woman, since it didn't threaten marriage or legitimate heirs. Roman law, therefore, carefully distinguished between sexual transgressions, reserving the harshest punishments for those undermining the patriarchal family and property rights, rather than simply punishing personal immorality. Scholars debate how effective Augustus' adultery laws really were. Did they reduce infidelity, or merely drive it underground? Some argue the laws were selectively enforced for political purposes, while others suggest they initially influenced elite behavior. Perhaps the fear of public disgrace and banishment was a stronger deterrent than physical punishment. These debates underscore how legal statutes often interact with human desire, with enforcement diverging from the law's written letter. The consequences of infidelity show that, while certain sexual behaviors were tolerated, others that threatened social order faced the full force of Roman law. From legal concerns about infidelity, your exploration moves to the arena, focusing on gladiators and their unique allure. While often seen merely as entertainers or condemned criminals, gladiators held a powerful, sometimes illicit sexual appeal, particularly among women, challenging social norms and occasionally sparking scandalous affairs. This fascination illustrates how desire could emerge in the most unlikely contexts. Despite their enslaved or low-status origins and violent profession, gladiators captivated Roman society, transcending social boundaries and stirring both admiration and controversy. Their lives were short, brutal, and often ended violently. Yet, gladiators were celebrities, the rock stars of their time, admired for their courage, physical strength, and exotic origins. Wealthy women, and even empresses, were known to be drawn to them, sometimes leaving respectable husbands for these fighters. The combination of danger, raw masculinity, and tragic circumstances created an irresistible allure. Imagine the Roman equivalent of a pop star, but one who might risk life and limb for your entertainment, and then be available for admiration afterward. A striking example of this fascination comes from ancient graffiti discovered in places like Pompeii. These inscriptions explicitly name gladiators and praise their sexual appeal. One piece refers to a gladiator named Celadus as the delight of all girls, while another declares Chrystrians, the net fighter, lord of the girls. These were more than casual notes. They were public declarations of infatuation, scrawled by women who viewed these fighters as objects of desire. This offers a raw glimpse into Roman popular culture, showing how deeply gladiators captured the imaginations of women, transcending social barriers between noblewomen and enslaved fighters. It's tempting to imagine what kinds of audacious notes might be sent to today's celebrities if public declarations of this nature were common. Scholars debate the roots of this allure. Was it purely physical attraction to their strength and exotic appeal? Or did fascination also stem from their defiance of death, mastery over their own bodies in a deadly arena, or perceived freedom from Roman societal constraints? Some argue that their low social status paradoxically increased their appeal, as relationships with them carried less risk for aristocratic women while offering excitement. This intersection of power, danger, and taboo highlights how attraction in Roman society could take unexpected, often scandalous forms. In bloodied glory, the gladiator became an unlikely symbol of forbidden passion. From the arena, we move to the pinnacle of Roman power, where sexual behavior was no less unconventional. Emperors and empresses are often imagined as paragons of virtue, yet historical records reveal a complex web of indulgence, ambition, and debauchery. Ancient historians meticulously documented private scandals, portraying rulers as violating the moral codes they publicly upheld. Accounts in the works of Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio describe everything from incest and polygamy to public orgies and extreme fetishes. Emperor Tiberius, for example, was portrayed indulging in depravity on Capri, while Empress Messalina, wife of Claudius, was reputed for an insatiable sexual appetite, even allegedly competing with prostitutes in sexual contests. Whether entirely accurate or exaggerated, these accounts shaped public perception and provided fodder for political rivals. A particularly extreme case is Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled briefly in the early 3rd century CE. He reportedly prostituted himself, had male lovers, married multiple women and at least one man, and even considered a sex change operation. While some details were likely embellished, They portray a ruler publicly subverting sexual and gender norms, using imperial power for performative defiance of societal expectations. Elagabalus remains one of the most sexually provocative figures in Roman history. Scholars continue to debate the reliability and bias of these accounts. Were these historians impartial observers, or motivated by politics, personal animosity, or the desire to entertain? How much reflects reality, and how much is literary embellishment aimed at portraying an emperor as degenerate? Even if some accounts are exaggerated, their existence underscores public fascination with the unrestrained power of emperors and its potential misuse, including in sexual matters. It demonstrates how power, morality, and scandal were deeply intertwined in the Roman imperial court. Descending from imperial excess, we turn to Saturnalia, a festival that celebrated role reversals and social license. Roman life was normally governed by strict hierarchies and codes, but Saturnalia temporarily upended these rules. Slaves dined with masters, wore their clothing, and spoke freely. Gambling, normally restricted, was permitted. This inversion celebrated a mythical golden age of equality and abundance while offering relief from social rigidity. Imagine your boss serving you dinner and inviting you to a rowdy game of dice, joking without restraint. The festival also had sexual implications. With social rules relaxed, there was increased indulgence and open display of desire, fostering flirtation, illicit encounters, and general merrymaking. While not orgies in the dramatic sense, the combination of wine, festivity, and role reversals created fertile ground for romantic or sexual interaction. Saturnalia offered a sanctioned period of freedom, a chance to break norms and embrace pleasure in ways that were otherwise socially unacceptable. The collective excitement and relief of these temporary liberties must have been palpable. A fascinating question among historians is whether the deliberate inversions of Saturnalia were merely a harmless social safety valve, momentarily subverting societal norms, or if they reflected a deeper Roman longing for a more relaxed, egalitarian, and sexually open society. Did the festival simply release otherwise disruptive urges, or did it offer a brief glimpse into an alternative social reality that Romans secretly desired? Consider whether the controlled chaos of Saturnalia was a clever form of social engineering or an annual acknowledgement that human nature, in all its complexity, required sanctioned expression. This reflection invites you to examine the psychology behind public festivals, showing how temporary transgressions can highlight, rather than weaken, the very rules they appear to break, a striking counterpoint to the rigidity found elsewhere. Moving beyond the intoxicating inversions of Saturnalia, our exploration of Roman sexual practices now broadens. We shift to a long-term perspective, the evolution of norms over centuries. You've witnessed a range of shocking, intriguing, and sometimes contradictory behaviors. But it's vital to recognize that ancient Rome was never static. Spanning over 1,000 years, from its early republican roots to imperial heights and eventual decline, Roman society continuously transformed. As the empire expanded, so too did social values, moral outlooks, and sexual norms. What was acceptable in one era could be scandalous in another. Understanding this evolution is essential. Roman sexual norms were never uniform. They shifted significantly across the Republic and Empire. In Rome's early Republic, for example, morality often emphasized male chastity before marriage and strict female fidelity. The paterfamilias, as head of the household, wielded enormous moral and legal authority. Yet, as Rome grew wealthier and more cosmopolitan, particularly in the late Republic, these strictures gradually loosened. Divorce became simpler, concubinage more common, and urban life offered a wider range of sexual opportunities. Imagine generations of Romans witnessing these changes, perhaps lamenting the good old days, much like the moralists we have studied. This long arc of change complicates any simplistic view of Roman sexuality. A significant factor shaping sexual practices was demographic change, particularly declining birth rates among the elite in the late Republic and early Empire. This worried emperors like Augustus, who enacted laws such as the Lex Julia et Papia to encourage marriage and procreation among the senatorial and equestrian classes. While not directly controlling sexual activity, the failure of elite families to produce heirs indicated shifting priorities, perhaps toward personal pleasure, luxury, or political maneuvering rather than family expansion. This demographic concern underscores how social behaviors, including sexual ones, had concrete implications for the state, prompting legislative intervention. Scholars often debate whether these shifts in sexual norms stemmed primarily from internal social and economic changes, like urbanization and increased wealth, or from external influences, including the influx of diverse cultures from conquered territories, especially Greece. Was Rome's evolution natural and internal, or a consequence of becoming a vast melting pot of ideas and behaviors? Was the perceived decline really moral decay, or merely a redefinition of acceptable behavior in a changing world, with new expectations for marriage, relationships, and expressions of desire? This long-term perspective illustrates the dynamism of historical societies, reminding us that even seemingly stable cultures continuously adapt their most intimate practices over time. The Rome of Caesar differed from the Rome of Hadrian, and both were far removed from the Rome of Romulus. Having traced the centuries-long evolution of Roman sexual norms, we now reflect on their enduring legacy and modern echoes. It may be tempting to dismiss these practices as relics of a distant past. Yet examining Roman attitudes toward desire, marriage, power, and the body reveals subtle, persistent influences on contemporary society. Many aspects of Roman sexual culture, particularly their pragmatic approach to law and power dynamics, have shaped Western legal and moral frameworks, even when later societies sought to suppress or reinterpret explicit behaviors. For instance, Roman laws focus on property, consent, or lack thereof, for enslaved individuals, and male dominance in marriage laid foundational principles for legal systems that persisted for centuries, influencing concepts of family legitimacy and sexual transgression. Even modern laws on adultery trace roots back to Roman legislation. Many assumptions embedded in contemporary legal codes and cultural norms are distant echoes of Roman pragmatism, now obscured by later moral interpretations. There are also more subtle cultural continuities. Modern Western societies often emphasize sexual liberation, yet Roman ideals around aesthetics, physical perfection, and public display of the body find a striking parallel today. Consider athletes, models, or social media culture. The modern obsession with idealized bodies, the fitness industry, and carefully curated public images echoes Roman admiration for the human form, sometimes for beauty, sometimes eroticism. This suggests that much of contemporary culture may be ancient human desires dressed in new forms. Modern scholarship increasingly explores how Roman sexual history challenges simplistic narratives of progress. Did Romans, with their relative comfort around nudity, frank discussions of sexual acts, and pragmatic approach to prostitution, enjoy freedoms lost to later puritanical societies? Or were these freedoms inseparable from oppressive structures such as slavery and patriarchy, making them fundamentally different from modern ideals? Understanding Roman sexual culture highlights an uncomfortable truth. Societies can be simultaneously advanced in some areas and deeply repressive in others. This reflection encourages us to appreciate the nonlinear trajectory of human sexual history, acknowledging that there is no single, straightforward path toward enlightenment. The shadows of ancient Rome, with their surprising and sometimes shocking details, continue to challenge our assumptions about what is natural, moral, or modern. Studying Roman sexuality is not just about understanding them. It offers a mirror into the complexities of human desire across all ages, inviting